Hey everybody. Now continuing on discussing the many events surrounding Operation Barbarossa, or the German attack of the Soviet Union in 1941. Now where I left off on the last video was things were going horribly, as was well known, and during the first week, and Stalin actually went into hiding. What happened before then is he technically resigned his position, and they had a statement written to tell the Soviet people what was going on, and Stalin didn't read it. He had Molotov read it. Then shortly after that he disappeared. There was 2 days where everything in Moscow was completely frozen. Nobody was willing to make any decisions whatsoever because Stalin was nowhere to be found. And so what happened was Voroshilov, Molotov, Malenkov, and Beria decided to go find him. And they find him in his dasha. Now, according to one of his guards, he just said he'd been there for 2 days, walking around the house all the time, didn't even get out of his work clothes, just was up wandering around muttering to himself about things and that with the party. And when the guys all showed up, they found him sitting in an armchair looking disheveled and frozen and just really stressed out. And after he's talking about, Lenin founded our party and things like that, he wound up saying once again, he looked up at the men and he simply said to them, "Why have you come?" And the men stepped forward and they told him that, "We want you to come back to work. We're going to set up this new committee of the Soviet Defense Committee, and we want you to be the head of it." And he goes, and putting it in my own words, said, "Am I really the one capable of doing this? I'm sure there's other people more worthy." And with that, Voroshilov said, "There's none more worthy." So this was a time where Stalin was in a very vulnerable position. And as historian David Reynolds put it, he said this is the one chance they had to really dispose of Stalin and to get rid of him. But he said his men did not have the guts to do it. That was such the position of terror that Stalin had over his people. And so Stalin wound up coming back to work, and he stepped right back in being his normal self. One of the things he did was Order 270, which is anyone who is caught surrendering or is taken prisoner, your families at home are going to pay for it. A very cruel and very barbaric thing that Stalin put into place. And thousands and thousands of families in the Soviet Union innocent families paid the price for something on this. Now, there was one particular instance where I mentioned this in a previous post, where there was a commander of the 14th Howitzer, and he was fighting bravely. He actually got commended for his bravery, and he was surrounded and refused to surrender, and he announced himself as the son of Joseph Stalin. And it was correct. It was Anton Yakov Zhikashvili. And they took him and held him, and word reached Stalin that his son had been captured, and he had hoped that Yakov would have done the honorable thing, quote unquote, and committed suicide, but he didn't. So Stalin was furious with him once again for failing to kill himself. So some people have asked the question, like, okay, why was Stalin so barbaric in sending his own kid to the front? I've heard two different sides on this. One that fits, the most commonly accepted one, is that Stalin just didn't care. And another being was, someone actually threw this out there, and I'm not sure if this could be considered not appropriate but correct, where he said, how could Comrade Stalin ask everyone else to sacrifice their children, send them out to the front lines, if he was not willing to do the same? But what actually diffuses that was, after Yakov was taken prisoner, one of his other sons, Vasily, he actually liked Vasily, he actually ordered him to stop doing combat missions. And he said, one son is enough. And so that's what happened in that particular situation. Now, the invasion was still going forward. Minsk had been taken, and the Germans were closing in on Kiev. And things were getting horribly worse there, and it got to where party boss Nikita Khrushchev was about to surrender, because they were about to be surrounded and things were not going well. And Stalin got on the phone and says, in my own words, he said, "No, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. You've already given them half the Ukraine. You want to give them the other half? Basically, you get this wrapped up," he said, "or we'll make short work of you." And he slammed down the phone. And so under Stalin's orders, they held their ground, even though they were being surrounded by the German commanders. And at one point, this is a double-edged sword here I'm talking about on this one, because they wound up surrounding Kiev, on the middle of July of 18, wrong war, of 1941. And what happened was, in the pincer movement, they wound up surrounding Kiev, trapping 5 Russian armies in there, upwards of 400,000 men. And what was interesting about that was, Khrushchev wound up escaping, of course, and Stalin didn't want to punish him too badly. But what happened with that was, Kiev was taken. But before that, Hitler made a very, very interesting move that some people think might have cost him the war in that particular situation, where he was the Army Group Center. They had Army Group North, which was heading toward Leningrad. Army Group South, which was heading toward the Donbas regions, the Caucasus, trying to get the oil. And Army Group Center, which was heading straight for Moscow. Leningrad and the Kiev region and the Donbas in the southern Ukraine were not falling as easily as he wanted them to fall. And so he decided to split Army Group Center and send half of it north to help with the Leningrad situation, and send half of it south to deal with Kiev. And although they wound up just further isolating and surrounding Leningrad, because Hitler didn't actually want to take Leningrad. He actually ordered the city to be razed to the ground. And so they dug into what was one of the most stubborn defenses of the war in Leningrad, to where it actually held out. That began the beginning of a 900-day siege of Leningrad. There's a lot more on that. I'll come on that later on. But by moving the troops south, they were able to finally take Kiev. But what happened there was they lost valuable time that they could have been using to keep marching on Moscow. So by the time they got it all organized and got moving in there, they were slowed down. But they were also slowed down by something else. One thing that the Germans did not realize in this whole situation was that, yes, they were invading the Soviet Union and technically knew which way they were going, but they didn't take into account that the majority of Russia's roads were not paved. What does that mean? What does that matter? It means that during the winter months, when anyone's trying to move during the winter months on an unpaved road, it gets pretty ugly. But in the Soviet Union, it got even worse. They had what was called the Raputista, or the thaw. That is where every fall and every spring, the fall being from the fall rains, and the spring due to the winter thaw, that everything gets so saturated, all of the roads become a thick mess of goo. I kid you not, it's like so thick you can't walk or drive through it. It's a horrible, horrible mess. I mean, I worded it one way of trying to imagine driving your truck through a big puddle of molasses. That's basically the equivalent of what you were dealing with. And so that really slowed the Germans down in that particular situation, because the German army moved their men by truck, moved most of the stuff by truck. So their trucks were all getting stuck. Those trucks and the horses and animals are all getting stuck. Where the Soviets, to deal with that problem, they moved all their stuff by rails. That's why the Red Army was always much more proficient at moving their men and material. So these were some of the factors that were happening in the time around July of 1941. So there's a lot more on that to come. So there you go.